Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, I want to have an in-depth look into Tinkerer, but specifically on strikers, as we'll limit it to just strikers for this video, as well, kind of making the spreadsheet for this video. I kind of had some scope creep in, and I quickly realized that this would be an exceptionally long video if we kind of try to cram everything into one video. Turns out there's a lot to discuss with the Tinkerer. There's a lot of things it can do, and we have to kind of, take the time to discuss that, but then we'll split it up into multiple videos. So this one is definitely just going to cover strikers, and then in the future, we'll come back for some of the other red builds, and then also what it can, for instance, do for hybrids and such. But strikers itself can be kind of a stand-in for most of the full red builds. So if we're kind of looking at, let's say, Heartbreaker or Umbra or Negotiator, or even the upcoming tipping skills or Virtuoso or things like that, this can be kind of a stand-in for them, as with the exception of Umbra and Negotiator, most of them kind of land in the same ballpark stat-wise. Those have the two listed ones there have a little bit more crit chance, so they land up a little bit higher there, and that, for instance, some of the crit damage talents get affected. But we'll delve into them as well, as we'll do a separate one and kind of go into some of the red builds. On this one, we're keeping it kind of limited to strikers. And yeah, for this, I've prepared a pretty big spreadsheet we're going to go through. We're especially going to look at different weapon classes, so looking at ARs, LMGs, and SMGs, especially here. And especially kind of looking as well in the dynamics between those, because for instance, in the AR category, we have things like the Lexington, which kind of make a discussion happen because we can't use named items with it, of course. In the LMG class, we have a talent in Frenzy, which is very, very powerful and can actually be very effective. So we'll kind of delve into those. But first, let's go get started and actually discuss where we get it from, and then also what it actually does, this Tinkerer. So let's start with that and then delve deeper, as the Tinkerer is the reward for the climax mission, especially of this season. So to get access to that, first of all, we need to actually complete 2 of the scouts of the manhunt. We no longer need to do all of the scouts, but we especially have to do these high value target ones, which is Scout 12 here, and then the other one being Scout 8. Once you complete just those 2 high value targets, then you'll get access to the climax mission. So if you're kind of catching up, it is actually nowadays very easy to do so, as you can just complete those 2, gain access to the climax mission that is here on the Potomac Event Center. Now, once you get access to it, first you have to complete it actually on a difficulty below Master, so either Heroic, Challenging, Hard, or Normal, to gain access to Master. So you have to kind of complete it once, and then Master unlocks for you. Now, on Master difficulty, on your first completion of it, you will get the Tinkerer as a reward, guaranteed. So there is a guaranteed drop chance per character. So especially if you have multiple characters, you can actually get multiples, for one for each character. You would have to then, basically unlock, because the scouts are account-wide, but the unlocking of Master is per character. So you would have to do it basically on each of those characters on a sub difficulty, and then on Master. There's also a drop chance basically for the item. It is the completion reward for the mission, and it seems to be the same as most of the other exotics, which is that it's 1% on normal, 3% on hard, 5% on challenging, 7% on heroic, and Master seems to have a 10% chance of it giving you an extra Tinkerer basically for completing it. The Master difficulty is definitely doable. This isn't a very hard mission. In even a mediocre team, you will kind of get through it, maybe with some struggles, as there was some bugginess around it, of course, but that seems to have been mostly fixed. I'm not sure if it's completely fixed yet, as there are still some people reporting issues. You can also grind, for instance, on other difficulties. If you aren't comfortable on Master, you could grind some Heroic, and a 7% drop chance is basically a 1 in 14. That's still not great, but it's doable if you just keep at it. And you will gain 1 guaranteed for the completion of Master. That way is actually, I would say, overall the easiest way, even if you struggle a few times, even if you don't get the best teams. If you just matchmake for it, you will likely just get carried at some point just by getting a few decent team players alongside of you. And then, once we have it, of course, then what we get is this exotic mask, this Tinkerer. And its flavor text is very fitting here, which is why not both? And yeah, why not both indeed, as the abridged talent that it comes with alongside of its full red. And this was important as well, of course. It needed to be kind of full red in this way with a weapon damage, crit chance, crit damage, and a mod slot, where we can kind of match it up against things like the Coyote, because if we were to lose even one of these stats, it would lose some competitiveness. And yeah, it's good that it's a full red. Here we have the abridged. If your primary and secondary are not exotic or named, and now we do understand that, yeah, this named means any named. So it does exclude things like the Lexington, which is, for instance, a free talentable named weapon. It is in its stats, but that means that, yeah, it's excluding things like the Lexington, like the slingshot, like the breadbasket, like the white dead, like the mop. Any of those kind of items are excluded here. And it does actually make an impact because, especially for instance, in the AR class, Lexington is kind of in its own class almost. So yeah, it is. It does matter. And same, for instance, if we were to headhunt and use a white death, we can't. And yeah, so it needs to be not an exotic, not a named, and of the same type. Now, when they're talking here about same type, the way that I would generally refer to it is of the same class. So it needs to be ARs, two SMGs, two LMGs. Generally, the way that I use type is more, for instance, having the 3 falls together as a type. You don't need it to be the exact same weapons, as I've seen some people have that misunderstanding. No, it needs to just be 2 SMGs. So for instance, here we're pairing attack vector with the SMG9, and that will work perfectly fine. It doesn't need to be 2 attack vectors. And then importantly as well, the secondary weapons talent will also be applied to the primary weapon. So it's only the secondary weapons talent going to the primary and not the other way around. So you basically just want to use this primary. If you're using the secondary, you're just basically missing out on, well, an exotic talent here and then also not getting the weapon talent there. And also, this does not apply if the primary or secondary weapons talents includes weapon swapping, which is basically just unwavering. So you can't trigger any of the of those kind of talents where a weapon swap is included. And also does not apply if the primary and secondary weapons talents are the same, which we kind of already understood even from the PDS. But here they're clarifying as they added this last line in one of the recent patches. And yeah, that means that we can't do, for instance, double measured or double killer or double streamlined or such, because of course that would be exceptionally broken, as we could, for instance, trigger 2 killers with the same kill and then have those bonuses, or have streamline double going. So yeah, it needs to be 2 different talents between the primary and the secondary. And once we have all of that set up, let's actually look at how that looks when we're in the game. Because once we are actually in combat and in the game, what we see is that on the buff debuff bar, so there next to my striker icon, I have an abridged icon there. If it is orange, everything is working, and that's basically the indicator if you're doing it right. So for instance here, if I'm on my secondary, it'll go red. And when it is red, it is inactive. It will also go red. So for instance, if I, instead of having 2 correct weapon types, if we, for instance, grab a Dark Winter here, a named weapon, which, of course, does not work with this. When I even swap to my primary, it actually is showing up red, showing that there is something wrong. So unless it says orange, you're doing it, something has to be checked out. And one of the things is, though, that on other people, you may have already noticed some people having the abridged icon next to their armor bars or above their armor bars when you're in shared spaces and such, or actually if you're grouped up, if you're matchmaking, or if you're just with other players in your team. It will always, for others, show up red. So you can't from that conclude if they are or aren't using it correctly. But then, through inspecting them, you could actually see if they are correctly using it. And actually, it is important to maybe do that here and there, as I've seen plenty of people run the Tinker and then just have an Elmo equipped, or run the Tinker and have, a Dark Winter equipped, or things like that. And of course, in those functions, it just will not function. So if you see that out in the wild, make people understand that, and just point it out to them that how they are set up, and to check their buff debuff bar if it is orange or not. And if it isn't orange, something needs to be done. And then as well, the icon that, or the side of the weapon talent showing, because of course, a lot of the weapon talents show up on the side of the weapon. Here, for instance, we have fast hands showing there on its stacks. It is only going to show the secondary weapons talent. So whenever you have these weapons set up, if you want to see the talent showing up on the side of the weapon, you need it to be on the secondary. This can be, of course, kind of important if we have, for instance, measured and killer. I don't care so much when measured shows up, because measured will also have that icon. It is only going to show up on the second half of the magazine, but I already will know when the second half of the magazine is going to be, because the rate of fire just drastically changed. But then, for instance, if I have killer, it is actually handy to know when I have it activated. And, you know, if it's about to time out or such, so that I know that I'm going to lose some damage, I would definitely put that on the secondary weapon. And here as well, for instance, with fast hands, it is kind of handy to know how many stacks I'm getting, much more so than measured. And yeah, because of that, I do actually run that on the secondary weapons, especially as well for Frenzy, for instance, knowing, you know, if you've activated it, if it's active, or if it's going to time out in a little bit. For instance, we would definitely put that there. So if you want to have whatever you want to have on the side of the weapon, has to be on that secondary. Let's also quickly discuss the visualizing stats aspect of the Tinkerer. As we discussed in the visualizing stats video, and if you want to go watch that video as it goes over, for instance, kind of excluding all of the things that are the same between, for instance, two variants of a build, and then looking at only what changes. So for instance, if we're going from a chest striker to an obliterate striker, what changes between those? And then here, especially what we're looking at and what we'll be using as our metric to compare against is especially the Coyote. So we're going from this Coyote version. We're basically going from this, where it just has the Coyote talent and then this one weapon talent, and basically the rest of the build is of course the same. We're going to the Tinkerer, and what we especially get here is that we're getting this secondary weapon talent. So what it becomes in the end is that because of the way that this talent works, this of course isn't adding anything of its own. It is just bringing in that second talent. It becomes the Coyote's talent, its crit chances and crit damages bonuses, versus this secondary weapon talent. And what we already know is that, yeah, Coyote is kind of around 7 to 9% that it adds to a build, depending on what ranges you're in and how it's kind of set up. But for a general striker, that would be the ranges it would be in. Do any of the, for instance, if we do go double damage talent, do any of the talents exceed that? Definitely. For instance, things like measured, killer, streamlined, ranger in certain situations, not for say for SMGs, but for ARs and LMGs, definitely can exceed that 7 to 9% that the Coyote can add. So we can actually exceed the Coyote in damage. But then also what we can take, as well as we discussed, of course, is, for instance, taking utility as a secondary. So here I'm taking fast hands, even though as well, actually, this is also sustained DPS. So here, for instance, I would drop down quite a bit in my burst DPS, because fast hands doesn't add anything into that, because we would lose basically that 7 to 9% that we would get from Coyote. But then here, of course, I'm gaining a ton of sustained DPS, but also, for instance, fast hands to me is actually agency. So as long as I can fire, I can kind of affect my outcome. Because if I hit a weak point, if I hit some heads and stagger an enemy, for instance, or such, I can affect the outcome and I can maybe keep myself more upright. And especially having that agency is kind of the reason I go with a fast hands. And I used to go with fast hands, for instance, in the past quite a lot. Then measured and killer kind of got way bigger as they got buffed, basically. And it just, yeah, the damage that they could provide was actually so big that I definitely kind of went a different route. Also, actually, they reduced this from 4% reload speed bonus per stack to 3% here. So it also got actually a reduction. But now that we can have both, and yeah, that's kind of course, the trait of the Tinkerer. Why not both? Indeed, why not both? But yeah, in visualizing it, it is exactly that. We're basically trading, if we're going from, for instance, a Coyote to a Tinkerer, what we're trading is the Coyote's crit chance, crit damage talent for a secondary weapon talents. And definitely some of those can exceed it. So yeah, let's actually go look at those in the numbers. And for that is this spreadsheet that I've prepared. This is of course linked down below in the description, so you can go to it for yourself. We'll be especially discussing the first 4 multi-calculators on this, as that is an AR striker, an LMG striker, and then secondary LMG striker, and then also an SMG variant of striker. As you can already see, I have some other ones filled in, and we'll come back for those in the future. As I started filling in more and more and kind of looking into more and more builds, I realized, yeah, we kind of need to split this up, as otherwise it would be very long. But we'll come back to some of those, as for instance, some ODs already prepared in here, and then also, for instance, a negotiator, turret drone hybrid, for instance, as well. But we'll double back for those in a future video. For today, yeah, we'll be keeping it to these first 4. And these are multi-calculators of my design, and they are set up to compare up to 10 builds, and we'll be using them basically fully for here. And basically what will happen is that there is input that is happening in the fields below here together with the weapon inputs here. And what we're especially getting out is a mag damage and burst DPS and sustained DPS number out of it. And together with that as well, some checking numbers that I can use, for instance, in my case, at the range, and make sure that we're lining up actually what we're inputting, that it's lining up with the game. In here, then, yeah, we'll be comparing up to 10 builds and especially looking at its burst and sustain numbers, and we have percentages for those. The percentages in general we'll be comparing into whatever is in the top slot. So here, for instance, everything is comparing to this Coyote. Let's go get started with this AR one. So let's dive into this AR one first. And the AR one is, yeah, a very important discussion to be had because we have the Lexington in that category. The Lexington is the better weapon versus what we're picking for the Tinkerer, which is the FAMAS. The Lexington basically has a percentage and a bit more on burst, quite a bit more on sustain, and then as well actually has handling-wise, it's, well, on accuracy, they're kind of, actually I would even give it to the FAMAS maybe, on the stability end and the recoil pattern end, the Lexington has the FAMAS beat by quite a bit. So on the Coyote, we get to use the Lexington. On the Tinkerer, we don't. And because of that, that does actually affect the outcomes, especially for ARs here. Then, yeah, we also have a toggle here to take the main talent and what we want to have as the main talent on it. So here, actually, we can toggle this between Streamline and Killer. And then what we have on the Tinkerer end is then, for instance, Streamline plus Killer, and then plus Measure plus Ranger. And one of the things to, yeah, keep in mind is, while it is in here, but that's just for the Killer end of things, this is Streamline plus Streamline. And yeah, that number is, of course, fictional because we can't take 2 of the same talent. Same as well, once we toggle to Killer, we don't actually look at the Killer plus Killer because that's also, again, a fictional number. But yeah, just for easiness, we have them both here just so when we toggle to the other one. Then as well, actually, for the utility one, because we have here one with utility, you can see that as well as no damage talent. So especially as well, when, for instance, Killer isn't active, it would be this number, basically. And same, for instance, for anything else that is inactive at the time. For instance, if you lose your Streamline, if we're running Killer plus Streamline, then yeah, we would have that impact, of course, our how much damage we do because it would be inactive. So we can kind of see the utility number as that. One of the toggles I have here as well is we can toggle actually the utility to become fast hands. And that's just to save some space, and we can just alter that reload speed depending on the crit chance and the max size that we have there to give us an increase, or give us a decrease on the reload basically and an increase on the sustained DPS, just so we can discuss some of the fast hands numbers as well. Let's keep it toggled to 20% and this 20%, or to Streamline, and this 20% headshot rate as well. We'll be using 20% headshot rate for all of the upcoming ones. That's generally the number that I take, and then just that is basically meaning that 1 in 5 shots is going to be a headshot. And generally, I find that to be a better amalgamation than taking 0% or 100% on the headshot. And that is actually important here as well, as it does, of course, headshot and crit damage are combining into the same pool when in the calculation. So it is actually important and affects especially the outcomes of something like Coyote or Killer that affects crit damage quite a bit. And then, yeah, here we also have the Coyotes at the 0 or the 15 to 25, 0 to 15 and 25 plus, because of course the Coyote has their 3 different ranges. We shouldn't just look at the preferred range because we're kind of set up for that 15 to 25. Later on with SMG, we'll be set up for the 0 to 15, for instance. There is a preferred range generally that we take with the Coyote, and then on the other ones, we generally lose a little bit. So we have to kind of look at that as well, because with the Coyote, yeah, sometimes you will be in the wrong range. You can kind of course, control that. You should control that. But then, of course, as well, there's rushers just rushing you down, and then you will be in the wrong range for it. And you will lose, on average, yeah, basically 3%, a little less than 3% that we see here, basically, for a full red like this. We're also going for a full red version of Strikers. And then, of course, here as well, with 30 grading, which does affect, of course, things like Streamline and Measured, which are... yeah, going to be going into those pools as well, or taking from those pools, and it affects them as well. So those are the metrics we are going to go for. And yeah, if you want to, for instance, play around with it, you could, of course, just go to the link in the description and copy this to your own Google Drive and alter the numbers. If you don't have, for instance, grading, you could set these all to 0 and see, for instance, what the numbers would be for you. Here for this discussion, I am going to keep this on these numbers. If we have a Streamline activated here, especially with Streamline plus Killer, what we see is that we are actually gaining quite a bit over the Coyote. And that's actually the thing throughout this whole discussion, especially if you are okay going Streamline and giving up your skills, which is a big ask. And for myself, I'm not that okay with that. I don't enjoy running Streamline because I like having my pulse. I like having my Revive Hive, and I use my Revive Hive quite often. Not because I'm bad, but because it's a tool to me. It's a thing that I will use and consume to get going through combat quicker, basically. I will risk things while I have my Hive. Sometimes I'll win, sometimes I'll lose and lose the Revive Hive. But overall, I will be faster than just playing it super safe. I can't do that with Streamline. And because of that, this number, well, pretty hefty. It is actually not something I would go for. But this is the bigger one, especially if you are going with ARs. Yeah, you should go, if you really want to get the most out of Tinker, especially, you need to go kind of Streamline. So you compare it with Killer, and that gives one of the bigger outcomes. Now, of course, Killer activates quite a bit and has a pretty high uptime, especially if you are getting the kills. For just general use, missions, control points, activities and such, it will be perfectly fine. You will get more than enough kills to keep it activated and going basically, yeah, with a very high uptime, because we will definitely lose a little bit of this percentage, but we could still likely be 5 or 6% ahead, even if we kind of account for that. The thing to then kind of think about is that, yeah, when Killer is not active, we're kind of 10% behind. When Killer is active, we're 10% ahead. So on average, if we have a decent uptime on Killer, we're gonna be ahead quite a bit if we go Streamline plus Killer. Streamline plus Streamline, yeah, again, not real. We can't really look at that number. But what we can actually deduce from this is that actually Streamline, while very strong, here would actually not work out that well if we had double Streamline because of the diminishing return. We're pushing that weapon damage pretty high here, and we're really seeing some diminishing returns there. But then, yeah, Streamline plus Measured. Streamline not being Killer on this is bigger than Streamline. Streamline here with Measured is actually not beating out the Coyote by that much. But here, especially with Streamline and with Measured, we have two talents that we can keep decent uptime on. Especially Streamline, we can control kind of. Measured has just, we're averaging out to this and will do this average basically. And what that means is that we can actually be a little bit more consistent, at least on the burst end, versus if we're looking at the Coyote version. We will still lose out on the sustain end because we're taking a Lexington versus a FAMAS, and that difference in sustain between those two is very big. So we see that in here as well. Ranger at 20 meters here. Now, Ranger, if you're using it, you would want to be exceeding 20 meters, basically. Generally, I wouldn't still recommend that with ARs. You could take an optimal range mod, you will lose a little bit more crit chance, and then you would kind of need to be in the 30-meter range for this to really be impactful. But even here at 20 meters, we do have, you know, a decent outcome, and we could again make the case for this Streamline plus Ranger having the consistency, and then as well, even in close range, or if we're, you know, in the right range, we're kind of close enough. But again, we're losing a little bit on that sustain end because we're using a FAMAS and we're losing some some sustained DPS versus that Lexington that is up there. Here as well, we're using Flatline. Flatline here, though, we're using it actually with a P416 because, of course, the FAMAS does not have a long rail, so we're excluding that. To have the long rail in there with the link laser pointer, we're going to a P416 as our weapon there. And we see actually that Flatline because, yeah, definitely the P416 is lower on burst sustain than or burst damage than it is burst DPS specifically than the FAMAS. It is actually making up for it because, yeah, it is actually more than that overall, more than that Ranger. We are, of course, giving up that crit chance mod for it. So I am actually doing it, you know, we are. But of course, then still it is in the 12 to 13% region for Flatline. So it is actually making up for the lesser weapon as well there. And we could, again, make the case for this, and especially our sustain isn't even that far behind. And then if we're in the wrong ranges, we're still doing okay. Then lastly, we have the utility, and yeah, especially fast stands and preservation and future perfect can be very impactful. But all of those do basically other things than damage. With preservation, we can have some healing with future perfect. If we're kind of feeding it into skills and using it effectively, that can be really impactful. And of course, just fast stands can add to our sustain end. So here, actually, if I toggle this fast stands on, if we are taking, for instance, Streamline plus a utility, while our burst is way lower, our sustain is actually on the FAMAS, exceeding the sustain DPS on the Lexington. So yeah, that can be very impactful. And of course, again, fast stance, for instance, as well, on a weapon like a FAMAS, which has, even with Strikers 15 weapon handling and such, is still a pretty high up there reload speed. Or reload time, yeah, cutting that basically more than in half, that really does, a little less than in half, really does help us out here because, yeah, we do actually reload so much faster if we are getting decent amount of stacks. Here we are basing the stacks as well. Actually, it's not just full fast stands. It is based on the mag size plus crit chance, but kind of assuming that we're hitting all of the shots. So in general, our reload will be a little bit slower than this because this is assuming kind of perfect situations, although as well, you can get lucky and get a lot more crits than you theoretically would have from this. Then actually, if we toggle this now back to Killer, Killer, of course, is a bigger talent on its own than Streamline. So what we see here already is if we're actually, and keep in mind as well, this Killer will also, it's also going into the Coyotes as well, of course. So it is the main talent on all of these. If we're then looking, yeah, we shouldn't look at Killer plus Killer because, yeah, that can't happen. But if we're looking at Killer plus Streamline, the number is the same as we had a moment ago, but the percentages aren't. So the number here is the same as we had with Streamline plus Killer on the burst DPS, the absolute number. But of course, Killer being a bigger number is also going into that Coyote variant. And now our differences are a little bit smaller. If Killer is our main talent, and we're basically using that as our main talent as a comparison point on the Killer, or on the Coyote, yeah, it is actually impactful. So here we see that if we are comparing against Killer main weapon on the Coyote, it's now just around 6% with that Streamline coming in. That's kind of expected. Again, Streamline is around 16-ish%. Coyote is around 9 to 10%. So we see that basically add up to here to being 6% ahead. Sustain-wise, it is also kind of catching up there. Now, of course, we need to activate Killer, and yeah, we will not have perfect uptime on Killer. I'll leave it up to yourself to kind of decide how often it is and it isn't up. And again, the other number that we would be comparing against would be this utility one. So when the Killer is inactive, it will be this basically this utility number, and then when it is active, it is the number up here. Pairing Killer and Measured, we get a little bit better results because Killer is already a little bit bigger, and also Killer is going into that crit damage and such and not getting in the way, for instance, of Measured here. And yeah, we see that as just a little bit ahead. Here we could still make the case because especially if we're comparing it in the Coyote versus in the wrong ranges, we are actually a hefty amount ahead with, you know, a worse base weapon. Because especially as well, if we compare it actually against the numbers from the Coyote plus FAMAS, if you don't have a Lexington to begin with, although of course the stretch goals are here there are options of getting a Lexington, even though they seem kind of, dreadful chances. Plenty of people have already reported that they've gotten one at least. And yeah, if you grind hard enough, I trust that you'll get one. Yeah, that will help out quite, when we're comparing against the Lexington. Yeah, it does lose, of course, a little bit for the FAMAS here. That's actually the true line for the ARs as well. It is just that the Lexington is also so good that we kind of, especially on the sustain end, can't keep up with the FAMAS, that there is actually really still a good case to be made for a Coyote keeping going with a Coyote just to keep the Lexington in play. Here as well with Killer, if we can actually look at its sustain or on its burst number with utility, it is actually a tiny bit higher than Streamline, of course. But then what we have as well, and also this is kind of affecting the Coyote, of course, because we're putting more into crit chance, crit damage pool basically together. And yeah, that is affecting the outcomes of that. And if we go with fast stance here, yeah, we can actually exceed the Lexington with that FAMAS on the sustain end pretty heavily. But that's, of course, yeah, adding in fast hands there and losing out on the burst DPS quite heavily. Overall, with the ARs, I definitely feel there is a case to be made still for going, especially the Lexington. And it's also partially in its handling, because especially as well, the handling on that Lexington is much more usable than for instance, we have with going Tinkerer and a FAMAS. Then alongside of that, we have several ARs that are exotics that are pretty good in the AR category. Both the Bighorn and the Strega and the Chameleon, actually all three of those, can be pretty effective. And yeah, we'll look into that actually a little bit more in the future. But of course, you can kind of compare them already by comparing the Coyote versions, kind of what we have the numbers here for, or comparing these basically up against the AR on Striker or ARs on Striker. But yeah, you would just have to look at this number and you can compare them directly to that, because actually on our metrics, we are keeping it the same. So they are actually directly comparable. But yeah, that AR basically, especially that Lexington being in there, means there is still a case to be made for this Coyote, especially as well in a coordinated team. You would want one Coyote in there. One of the ways to set this up as well is, but you would lose a little bit here on the balance of crit chance, crit damage, is actually just to stick a Tinkerer in there with a crit chance mod underneath it. What would happen there is that you would go to 57 crit chance instead of the 51 that you would be on with a 3 crit chance mod weapon. And that works out fine enough. It isn't optimized. If you are wanting to go the Tinkerer just all the time, you would want to go with those two crit damage mods on the weapon and then, yeah, land on this 59, especially for activation rate of Killer. That kind of matters quite a bit. But what you can do is just for ease of use is because then you can swap between the Coyote and the Tinkerer at will. Because if you just stick in the Tinkerer, you will be at 57. If you go back to the Coyote with a crit damage mod, you would be on 51. And that is basically, you know, set up for the Coyote on mid-range. So you could swap them out at will. And in that way, because, yeah, if there isn't a Coyote in the team, it is actually advisable to take and become that one Coyote in the team, because alongside of our numbers, of course, even if we're giving up a little bit, we're giving to the team. And even giving, you know, 4 players just 10 crit damage, even if they're not set up to take the crit chance on top, will actually be a better outcome than just, you know, selfishly somewhat going for the Tinkerer on top. So Coyote is still definitely good, especially in the AR setting. Let's actually start moving to the LMG side of things. And let's indeed go to those LMGs where we don't have that uber weapon anymore in the Lexington. So we're just comparing between Mark 46s. Now again, we have that same toggle here for Streamline or Killer as a first talent, and then we're pairing that with a few talents over here. The Coyote here is just, again, taking just that one talent. What we have here is kind of the same list. We're putting Ranger to 28 meters. We're adding in Strained as well, as Strained is on LMGs or on longer firing time weapons can make a difference. And we'll kind of see as well, especially, of course, we could compare that to, for instance, Measured. And then also on LMGs, we have Frenzy. But we'll also look at Frenzy together with some of the other talents actually down here, as we'll look more in depth into Frenzy, because Frenzy, of course, one of the bigger bonuses that we can get, although of course it requires unloading a whole mag before we actually activate it. Then again, we have with the utility, we can actually toggle it to be fast hands. We're taking again as well 20% headshot rate as we do with all of these. Then if we kind of actually compare the Coyote versus the Tinkerer here, for instance, with Streamline plus Killer, we see actually that the differences, especially on the sustain end, aren't that big. Mostly because, yeah, we're no longer comparing a Lexington to a FAMAS, which does have hefty changes in the sustain DPS end. Here, it is the same weapon all across, so we kind of see a fairer comparison. But also on the AR end, I feel we need to compare it in that way because we do have the option with the Coyote to go Lexington. We just don't have that option with the Tinkerer. So here we see that especially Streamline being a little bit smaller than Killer coming in as a big talent. Now, of course, again, that when it's inactive, it is basically this utility number. And then when it is active, it is this plus Killer number. And so we're straddling a -8 and a little bit, and almost 11% on the other end. With the activation rate of Killer, I feel this is very much a way to go. You would need to be okay with Streamline. With LMGs, it's a little bit easier for a lot of people because you're already not using a shield. For myself, I still, for instance, with LMGs, do love smart cover or just having a pulse to see the enemy or having a decoy to make the enemy not shoot me, or a foam to kind of make one enemy a very easy kill at the very least. All of those tools are taken from you if you go for this route. But you do also gain quite a bit of damage. Streamline plus Killer is definitely the big winner for Tinkerer, but you have to be willing to go that Streamline route. If we then go actually Streamline plus Measured, for instance here, Streamline actually does help Measured a little bit in the grand scheme of things, as this going into that weapon damage pool, making that first half of Measured actually a little bit better, as it is a minus weapon damage. So it depends actually how high that is, and how effective how much effect you get out of Measured. And especially if we kind of compare it as well, for instance, here we're taking Ranger to 28 meters. All of the LMGs have generally higher optimal ranges. So for instance, even the Mark 46 that we're looking at here has 35 meters optimal range, which is on the higher end of, for instance, the ARs. And some LMGs even have 40 meters optimal range. So you can actually reach out a little bit further. And also with how they become more accurate as you keep firing, you can actually reach out a little bit more. And actually, once they kind of get going, they can be more accurate than some of the ARs. Here with having that Ranger at 28 meters or above, because the way to kind of look at Ranger is you basically divide the range by 2 and you kind of get a guesstimation of your amp. Now it is actually in discrete chunks. It is every 4 meters it gains 2. It isn't for whatever range divided by 2. So yeah, even if we were, for instance, here 31 meters, a meter short of the next chunk, we would still be 14%. So we don't gain in that way. But as a general, just quick, if you go 30 and you go 15, even though that's practically impossible, it is actually a very quick and easy, just on averaging it out kind of number. We see actually that, Ranger kind of gains quite a bit. Here as well, with Strained, we see actually that Strained beats Measured. There is actually a difference, though, here with how they act, of course. So Strained, if we stop firing for half of a second, we will lose the bonuses and we'll drop all the way back down and then start building back up once we start firing again. Measured, if we stop firing, that doesn't do that. So especially that difference means that even though that Strained here, for instance, is a percentage point ahead of Measured, here Streamline plus Strained and Streamline plus Measured, it is actually not one that I would pick just because of that. Because unless you're kind of firing most of the time, basically all the way to the end of the magazine, you're not going to see this average number, because this average number is based on just unloading the magazine all the way, all the time, which just doesn't happen in real gameplay. So it is a little bit lossy, so we'll lose a few percentage points there, in the same way that, for instance, with Killer, because of its activation rate, we kind of have to see it as being a little bit lower. Then we see strained or a sadist actually here. So sadist, of course, yeah, we can't just generally use that. We would need an OD or something in the team. But especially with an LMG where we have 150 rounds versus an AR where we have 50 rounds, when a marked enemy dies, marked by the OD, by being shot when they are status affected, the OD gets a full mag. Everybody else in the team gets half of a mag. Now, half of a mag of an AR, 25 rounds, isn't much. Half of a mag of 150 on an LMG is much more impactful. This also means that we can bleed much more consistently. Now, of course, this still isn't perfect because, yeah, we have the diminishing returns on the status effects and such. So, yeah, that kind of gets in our way a little bit. And but it is much more impactful if we have an OD in the team to, for instance, go Streamline plus Sadist or Killer plus Sadist, and then kind of hedge our bets basically, where if we are getting that bleed on that enemy, if that enemy is bleeding, we can do a lot more damage on them, but at the risk of, especially as well, of course, if we aren't shooting at something, or for instance, we're shooting at a mechanical, then again, this would be that utility number. So we're going to be straddling that line. But this, of course, with Sadist is much larger, but we kind of do need an OD in the team for that. Frenzy is humongous. Always is going to be. Here actually with Streamline is, of course, going into weapon damage. An portion of, although even the big portion of Frenzy is especially the rate of fire, but there is also a portion of weapon damage that we get out of it. So actually, Killer plus Frenzy, as we'll see in a second, is a much more impactful increase than this, even though this is still humongous. Now, of course, for Frenzy, we need to unload a complete mag, and then we reach it. So we have this whole firing time, and then we reach it, and then we have it for 9 seconds. And yeah, that can be, of course, not something for general use, even though when we're kind of hedging our bets in this way, because if we don't have Frenzy active and we're just 10% behind, but when we do have it active and we're 46% ahead, now it makes a lot more sense. And I feel especially with LMGs, Frenzy is one of the top picks. Here's what actually, if we have fast hands going together with the utility there, because we see with the utility, we're kind of losing basically around just over 8% here going versus that Coyote variant. And that's basically, yeah, the loss of the Coyote talent that we see there. If we take fast hands though, we on the sustain end at least are way up ahead now. And fast hands can of course be very impactful. I feel though that on LMG, so fast hands especially, what really also matters for it is how often you are hitting the reload. On a 150 round mag LMG, we're actually hitting the reloads quite a bit less than we are on an AR. So even though the impact on it on the reload is more, the general impact of it is actually less because we're just reloading less with an LMG. This is though a thing though that, yeah, this is kind of in the theoretical, but in the practical, quite often, once we have expended 100 rounds and we're going into a different room or something, or, you know, we have just nobody to shoot at and we're kind of waiting for somebody to come out of cover or something, maybe we will hit that reload. So we will actually hit it, of course, more often likely than this kind of predicts. But so it can be impactful, but yeah, it is definitely more impactful, as we'll see, for instance, in the SMG and the AR section that we saw. If we flip this now to Killer and kind of look at that as our main talent, what we see already is kind of the Killer being a bigger talent starting out. We already see, for instance, again, then that the numbers kind of shift if we're going Killer plus Streamline, because of course, what's shifting here as well is that this Coyote now has Killer instead of Streamline, which is a bigger talent even for the LMGs there. And yeah, we're still going quite a bit ahead, especially with the Killer plus Streamline. We shouldn't look at the Killer plus Killer again. Of course, that is basically impossible. Killer plus Measured is actually a little bit higher. And we see actually now that the Killer plus Measured has actually caught up to that Killer plus Strained. Now, the reason for this actually is that Killer and Strained are going into the same pool in crit damage, of course. So they're kind of getting in each other's ways. It isn't actually that Measured got bigger. Measured actually stayed the same, or well, equivalently the same as it's adding, but Strained actually dropped a little bit, and that's why it's catching up. And this is again why I feel like, yeah, especially if you're going Killer, I would go Killer Measured over Killer Strained, especially, and that already would have made sense because of the diminishing returns we would have on crit. Although we still see they're quite head-to-head. Stream or strained is actually pretty big on LMGs, just because if you're kind of taking the theoretical firing time of it, it kind of works out. Thing is, though, it doesn't happen too often that we're unloading 150 rounds. It still does happen, especially, you know, if we're kind of fighting a named enemy, if we're fighting a named heavy or such, you know, if we're fighting some inbred son of a bitch. We're going to expend 150 rounds likely on those fights, on the extended fights, but not always. And then again, we would need to actually keep firing and not, for instance, stop firing in between, because if we don't fire in half of a second, we will lose that strain buff. So I feel definitely measured, I feel it would be kind of still my floor. So anything below measured or kind of on par, but kind of worse, which strain kind of is to me, I would just go measured instead. That Ranger is also still looking pretty good here, of course, and yeah, it is even a little bit more ahead. Just being a separate multiplier kind of causes that. We see the Sadist as well, still at 20% ahead. This Frenzy, though, now, because especially when we saw it together with Streamline, that weapon damage component of it was actually getting hindered by Streamline. Here, we now have basically Killer going into crit, and then Frenzy going into weapon damage, and then going into the RPM. They're not getting in each other's ways. Those are three separate multipliers to each other. So we are actually gaining a bigger advantage from that versus the Streamline version. And yeah, this especially, I feel, is kind of the ways that I've been running LMGs quite a bit, is just going Killer and then Frenzy, and kind of hedging my bets, or going measured and Frenzy. And while, for instance, if we have Killer active, but we don't have Frenzy active, we would be on this 93% basically. Once Frenzy comes in, and if the fight is going on long enough, Frenzy is just going to come in, and we're just going to melt everything. Frenzy, being as big as it is actually worthwhile, for instance, on the Mark 46, especially, for instance, to go that route. If we have a large enough magazine that we kind of make a big Frenzy happen once it's active. But also, I would say not as big of a magazine as, for instance, a GR9, especially if you're taking it to 250 rounds, because then you're kind of, yeah, now you're not hitting it often enough. Here, we need to basically fire for 9 seconds to reach this Frenzy. And that does happen here and there. And of course, we can make it happen. We can prep here and there and just have it at the ready. Frenzy is one of the big ones, and that's also why we'll go and look at it in this second chart. But here in the end, basically going Killer, especially for me, is a good one. Killer plus measured here being far enough ahead, if we're on basically the same weapon as we are here, it can definitely displace Coyote. But again, in a 4-man, for instance, I would definitely lean towards having a Coyote in there. So I will still set up my, for instance, my LMG strikers to be that way, where the Tinkerer is with a crit chance mod, and then I have a Coyote with a crit damage mod, and I can hot swap them in. One of the things as well that we have with LMGs is that we can swap out the crit chance mods to crit damage mods, especially with the Mark 46. All 3 slots can be either crit chance or crit damage. So we can shift our crit chance, crit damage with that around as well. So we can actually use that as well, actually, as one of the other ways where we can flip 2 crit chance mods that we have on this weapon, because or 2 crit damage mods, because actually the Mark 46 here is set up with 1 crit chance mod and 2 crit damage mods for the Coyote. And then we can flip those 2 crit damage mods to crit chance for the Tinkerer, and then actually keep the Tinkerer with the crit damage mod. So several ways of setting it up there to toggle between them, to swap between them. Let's actually go and look at Frenzy here by itself as the first talent. As here we'll look for LMGs, the same Mark 46, although we'll add an MG5 and GR9 into the mix, but mostly with Frenzy. So now instead of that first talent being Killer or Measure, or Killer or Streamline, we're going with Frenzy as the first talent. So the Coyote is getting the Frenzy together with then the Tinkerer getting Frenzy plus Measured, Frenzy plus Strength, Frenzy plus Fast Hands, Frenzy plus Steady-Handed, and Frenzy plus Utility. We're kind of splitting up those utility ones here. And then also we'll look at an MG5 and a GR9, because of course Frenzy is based on mag size, and that can be very impactful, although as well, yeah, it comes with its own downsides. So again, Frenzy, we do need to empty the mag. The first mag will be unbonused. We can do that, of course, in preparation. So if we know that a boss is going to spawn, a raid boss is going to spawn, we could empty the entire mag and then just kind of prep the weapon. We would just empty the whole weapon out, not go through the reload animation, leave it, basically just swap to your secondary in preparation. Just before the fight starts, you swap to your primary, the reload happens, and now you have Frenzy active right away. So you can prep it in that way. Now, this was always an option, especially with secondaries. If you're going just with Coyote, you could have a prepped, for instance, M249 as your secondary, and then pull it out, when the boss starts. Here, though, of course, because we have to have the same two weapons, and the second weapon isn't bonus, we just don't want to be using it that much. That means that actually, we kind of have no option to kind of store it like that. We would have to, prep it just before the fight, but we can definitely do that. Here, Frenzy, it doesn't look like there is big percentage differences between these, but one of the things here is because the Coyote one is already as well with Frenzy active here, what we have is that this is 18 million burst DPS with that 20% headshot rate. Here, we're going to go upstairs and look at what, for instance, the Killer, as we're targeting the Killer here, that was a 13 million when Killer was active. So we're gaining quite a bit in burst DPS and in sustained DPS. But it's just, because of the Coyote one, the percentages wise, it seems a little bit tame, but we're in really high numbers here. If we compare that Coyote again at 15 to 5 and 0 to 15, we actually lose a little bit more on the Coyote end here when the Coyote is in the wrong range. So that is actually impactful a little bit. And then if we have, especially for instance here, we already saw Frenzy plus Streamline and Frenzy plus Killer basically upstairs, and they were pretty hefty increases here, especially Frenzy plus Measured as a comparison point is, and then Frenzy plus Strained, is that both of those talents, can actually add quite a decent amount here as well. Measured as well can actually help a little bit, or can be helped by the weapon damage bonus that Frenzy provides, and because of that go a little bit higher. But here as well, Strained is doing pretty well as well, because it is actually not being hindered, for instance, by Measured or by Frenzy being there the way that Killer was, for instance. Because they're not going into the same pool, they're not interacting into the same multiplier. Here as well, we have fast hands, but one of the things with fast hands is I have the firing times here on the side, and this is then the Frenzy firing time, and then this is the normal firing time without Frenzy activated. With the Measured one, we are actually including Measured into those numbers. What we have then is that, the fast hands, so for instance, if we're looking at Measured or just whatever, talent plus Frenzy, we have basically on the Mark 46, we have a 6.6 second firing time, or 6.5 with the Measured, and then we have basically a 3.6 second reload. And the combination of those two is longer than the 9 second of the talent of a Frenzy. So what with the Mark 46 will happen is that the 9 seconds will trigger if we continuously fire, and there are plenty of places where we will continuously fire again. For instance, some of the incursion, raid bosses, some even 4-man scaled bosses, heavies and such, will quite often, you can just unload a full mag and then go into the next mag basically, and need to do that as well for the damage. If that firing time is longer, and the firing plus reload is longer than 9 seconds, you will basically continuously keep activating it, because Frenzy doesn't refresh. So if you are a little bit under it, let's say, and you do your firing time and you reload. So for instance, with the MG5, we would see that its firing time and reload is way underneath the 9 seconds. When you hit that second reload, it doesn't refresh Frenzy. It's just that initial Frenzy will still be there, and you will just get a tiny amount of it on the other mag, and then the rest of the mag is on bonus. But now Frenzy has gone away, and now you can trigger another Frenzy again. So that is actually very impactful. And because of that, actually, the fast stance here doesn't work out with this weapon, especially. Because that firing time plus that reload, unless we're kind of stopping firing in between, which does in general play still happen quite a bit, if you're just fighting just regular enemies and such, because you need to, for instance, go from one enemy to another. So that does happen, and that can make fast stance plus a Frenzy kind of a choice. But yeah, for if you're just continuously firing, you need to be cognizant that, yeah, you actually are gonna kind of fizzle out, because yeah, that reload is gonna happen and you're gonna have a tiny bit of frenzy if you're just continuously firing. Now you could stop firing and such, but now you're losing some DPS, of course. One of the things is as well, I've actually included steady-handed here, but there is actually, of course, an ideological disparity here because frenzy needs a reload. Steady-handed does and basically doesn't reload the weapon. It just fills up the magazine again without a reload. So the two of them together makes little to no sense, even though I've seen actually some videos kind of pushing towards this. While yeah, on a theoretical sense, yeah, you could get some decent numbers out of it. This on a practical sense, if steady-handed is getting triggered, you're not getting frenzy. So you need to reload. You need to actually do the reload animation. At the end of the reload animation, you trigger frenzy. Here as well, utility, anything else like Future Perfect or such, we would lose quite a bit. And yeah, we kind of see as well on the burst end, if we're going with fast and steady-handed or utility, we are losing about just a little bit over 8%. But of course, that is against already that very big frenzy number. This still is a much bigger number than, for instance, taking killer first or taking measured first, or yeah, measured first, or even streamline first. And then especially, yeah, the frenzy plus measured is kind of what I would go with out of this pack. But as we already saw, measured plus killer is actually also a really good way to go. Measured here then as well would, yeah, kind of just be kind of always active, a very stable talent to kind of do some damage out there. And then once frenzy comes in, it really melts everything away. Then actually as well, comparing against the MG5, so MG5 has less mag size, but as a weapon, it is kind of 3-4% ahead on burst DPS end than the Mark 46 kind of is. Because of that, its base is kind of higher, but of course its frenzy is smaller, and we kind of see that. Now, of course, the firing time of the MG5 and such doesn't work out well with frenzy if you're just continuously firing for those moments that you would be continuously firing. Mostly because, yeah, its firing time, especially with frenzy up, is 5 seconds. It has then like a 2-second reload. It is actually going to just have a little tiny bit of frenzy if you're just continuously firing. You can, of course, mitigate that by not firing, but then the moments that you could, if you have like 3 heavies coming in at you in DUA legendary, yeah, that's kind of nice to have actually a continuous firing Mark 46 of that. Then we also have the GR9. Now, the GR9 can, of course, be set up in 200 and 250 rounds, especially that 250 round version from a numbers perspective. We do gain 20% over already a humongous number of that Coyote with that 18 million there. We're going to 22 million burst DPS here. Our sustain is going way higher than it, especially as well as we have actually a much longer firing time, and our reload is better as well. The issue with that is especially the normal firing time here. So we would, for the 250 round one, we would need to fire for 17 seconds. Now, unless you're prepping this, this is completely useless because in the 16 seconds, you are quite a bit behind because you don't have frenzy active, and then you're getting it. Now, if you do prep it, sure, fine, but especially with the Tinkerer, you can't have this as your secondary weapon at the ready. You kind of need it to be your primary, and because of that, it is kind of more of a hindrance because you have to kind of prep it on the spot. You can't prep it at the start of the mission where you're just waiting at the start of it and just prep it up. You have to do it in situ. So that's kind of annoying. And then as well, actually, I would also go with the rate of fire mag on it, because one of the things as well here, this 9 seconds firing time with the rate of fire mag, just having 200 round mag basically, that works out well with frenzy, and then you would have a full, basically the entire mag would be bonus. Here you're kind of taking longer to get there, and then also you're losing basically a second and a half, even if you're doing it perfectly, and then you would have to reload for another 2.9 seconds, and then you would get your next frenzy. I would definitely lean more towards this, even though like in numbers it seems a hefty difference. Just the usability of it is a very big factor. Frenzy is much more than its damage numbers, is how consistently you can make it happen. With 150 round Mark 46, where I can also just keep the button down and it will actually consistently be in Frenzy. And of course as well, what I can do is even just kind of waste ammo and just keep the button down and just make sure that we just, even if I'm going between targets, I'll just keep the button down and just spray and just make sure that I consistently have Frenzy up, even if we're wasting some ammo. With a GR9, for instance, if we are going that 250 round, well, it looks to be a humongous number and very effective there. Unless you're prepping it and you're killing that thing in that first mag, which is very likely as well that you will kill the thing in that first mag. Because, yeah, we're doing humongous amounts of damage in that singular mag. It is also very tedious for general use. So, yeah, it kind of depends if you're general using it or not. I feel using Frenzy with LMGs in general use, with Measured, with Killer, with Streamline, is actually one of the better uses of Tinkerer. Now, LMGs always have their own downsides anyway. As a class, there is a reason we use them less than ARs and such. They are less accurate on the first shots and such, and especially as well, they suppress quite a bit more than ARs and such do. And because of that, they are sometimes tedious, but definitely this Frenzy is really a good way to go. Frenzy plus Killer, Frenzy plus Measured, really enjoying those, and especially on that Mark 46. Let's move it on to this last one, which is the SMGs. And on the SMG end, it is actually a little bit simple, because here what we have especially is, yeah, again, we don't have something like the Lexington getting in the way, but we also don't have a super talent like Frenzy getting in the way. Especially with SMGs, there are actually talents that are very useful and are tied to SMGs, especially, for instance, Unwavering. But Unwavering we can't really use here because, yeah, weapons or weapon talents that are weapon swapping related are excluded from Tinkerer use. So yeah, we can't have Unwavering, as of course, yeah, that would generally be swapping to your secondary or swapping weapons to trigger it, and you can't do that with the Tinkerer. So it is actually pretty simple. Here we're taking the TAC Vector as our main weapon. Here again, we'll just look at the Killer variant of this. The Streamline version is actually kind of similar to the AR one that we saw. On SMGs, if we are setting it up at 0 to 15, that is actually the big change over here, is that we are packed on this 60 crit chance, even on the Coyote, because, yeah, we're just taking the plus 25 crit damage from the Coyote, which is one of the smaller bonuses than it. And because of that as well, we see that some of the versions that we'll see over here with the Tinkerer actually gain over it. We'll again have that plus Killer, plus Streamline, plus Measured, plus Fast Stance here just separated out, and plus Utility. Because, yeah, especially here, for instance, yeah, Optimist and Strained just are less than Measured, especially on SMGs, where on LMGs, at least Strained could be competitive with Measured, at least on the numbers end. In the practical end, I don't feel it is. But here, yeah, we don't have really any of those that line up versus Measured, and Measured is then kind of our floor. Any talents below it really doesn't make too much sense. Ranger as well here, of course, anything below 15 meters that we're kind of setting up our Coyote for, yeah, would just not be competitive against Measured. But then what we see is, especially if we're kind of looking at the being in the wrong ranges for the Coyote, if we are at that 25 meter plus range, and we of course are at 60 crit chance, so we have nowhere where that crit chance can go in. When we're leaving a gap of 10, even if we, from basically the long range buff, are just getting 10% of that into our AR variant that we saw earlier, we aren't losing as much as we are doing here. So this is around that 97% when we are actually in the mid range. But especially if we're in the long range, we're losing here basically a little under 6%. And that's a little bit more impactful, especially, of course, because, yeah, we are, we're kind of completely losing the Coyote at that point. But yeah, you just wouldn't want to engage at those ranges. You should be at least in the 15 to 25 meter range, but preferably in the close range, and that's 0 to 15. What we see here then as well is that, yeah, when we go, for instance, well, we shouldn't look at Killer plus Killer because, yeah, that's not a real number. But if we look at Killer plus Streamline, we would gain 9 percentage points here. One of the reasons we actually won't be looking much at Streamline is if we're going SMG, especially if we're kind of setting up for this short range, I would just never pick Streamline because I would want to have the Firewall Striker Shield. That Striker Shield has its own damage bonus. That would be much more useful than Streamline ever could be, basically. And because of that, we're just not even going to really consider it. If you want to go look at it yourself, or if you want to use Streamline, because your Purist does exist, and that does actually add a little bit in, then yeah, copy this and just play around with the numbers for yourself. Here though, yeah, that Firewall Striker Shield, the special shield of Firewall, that really is impactful. And because of that, yeah, I would just pick that and Killer plus a different talent than going Streamline. Here then, Killer plus Measured, especially on SMGs here, because we are pushing up our crit a little bit higher because of that second stat of SMGs. Coyote is less impactful overall. So actually we see that the Measured one is already, for instance, 4 and a bit % ahead, much more ahead than, for instance, that we saw with LMGs, where it was just around 3% ahead. This can definitely be a pick, because here as well, we are, especially if we're kind of looking at both ranges and kind of, yeah, sometimes we just have to shoot at a little bit longer range. Sometimes we're just excluded from closing the range in a literal sense. Enemies may be across a catwalk or something like Bank or in Grand Washington, where you have the balcony fight or such. You can't be in the right range. So yeah, you would also sometimes be in the wrong range. And we're kind of averaging these two out, then yeah, it is a big enough percentage difference to, for instance, go Killer plus Measured, especially for SMGs. Killer plus Fast Hands as well. Well, we do lose, of course, a little bit if we are losing that talent of Coyote, but because it's less impactful, because the crit in total is kind of higher in comparison to some of the other ones that we saw, gaining that sustain here, that sustain DPS here, is actually quite impactful. And of course, again, with a weapon that is reloading as often as attack vector is, it is even more impactful. The more we reload, the more impactful Fast Hands would be. And that has actually been one of my go-tos in general anyway. Going, for instance, Damage Talent plus Fast Hands has been one of my go-tos, and I've enjoyed that quite a bit. It isn't per se more damage, but it is much more comfortable. And because that has some value as well, we shouldn't exclude that. We shouldn't just look at damage numbers, but we should know how much we lose when we do so. And we do lose a little bit on the burst. We basically are, in that exact same range as the Coyote 25 would be here. But if we're gaining a little bit in the sustain, I'm perfectly fine with that. And then, yeah, when we have Killer active, we are kind of, not that far behind. And of course, both of them would have Killer active in the same way. Any other of the utilities would work well here as well, especially as we were talking about that Striker Shield. If we, for instance, go Future Perfect, for instance, as we get kills, we get more skill tiers. Those skill tiers will make a stronger shield, and yeah, that will defend us a little bit better. And yeah, that can be very impactful as well. Like Future Perfect plus shields has been a combo for forever. Here, especially if we can take a damage talent already and kind of hedge our bets a little bit, that, yeah, really catches up and makes it much more useful, because we are giving up then, for instance, here just under 6%, well, 5.5%, just a little bit over 5.5% of our damage. But yeah, if we have a much stronger shield, we can be much more in the enemy's faces and kind of use that and just exceed what we get in our damage just by how active we can be and how much more longer we can be out in the open. So all of those are kind of good picks, especially in the SMG category. Yeah, I feel going Killer, especially because we generally do want that shield in that close range gameplay. And yeah, pairing it with Measured, pairing it with Fast Hands, pairing it with a utility like Future Perfect, or even going Preservation, of course. Generally, with Preservation, I would make the choice to go Palisade first and Gunner first. Basically, those cost in opportunity cost basically less. But if we, for instance, go both Gunner and Palisade and then go Preservation on top, now we are going, 20% armor and kill on the kill, and then we have a regeneration of either 10 or 20%, depending on if we get a headshot kill that we can get from that. So we can get basically 30 or 40% armor on kill. Although one of them, the Preservation one, is, of course, works a little bit differently, where it's over time, of course. And yeah, that can be really nice. And of course, with the aggressive builds that SMGs generally can be, they'll be impactful. One of the things we'll look at as well, especially in the future, is Hunter's Fury and how that is impacted. Because especially with Hunter's Fury, if we are going Tinker, we have to take the chest or the backpack. And yeah, that is actually, yeah, that's impactful because we're losing a damage talent. And especially want to see actually what those variants, especially versus just a normal one, kind of gain or lose, especially if we're going very powerful talent where we have in shotguns, where we have Brazen and Pummel, for instance, and Brazen is very strong. We could go choices like that, and then comparing that between just Hunter's Fury, having that with Tinkerer, and then of course just as well pairing it versus high ends, because if we are losing a chest or a backpack talent, gonna guess that a high end is actually gonna land up around the same numbers. But here we already then know what it can do for strikers. So, and then in the future, we'll look at those as well. That brings us actually to the end here, as yeah, the future here we'll go and look into in future videos. But yeah, let's go and take it to a conclusion. And to conclude this video, Tinkerer is a very impactful piece, especially getting basically a weapon talent at the cost of a Coyote talent for instance, Striker, where Coyote is, one of the most used pieces for it. We didn't per se look against comparing against some of the other exotics. We could go there, but we've done that in the past, and we kind of know how the Coyote lines up against those, especially if you want to go, for instance, if you want to dive deeper into that, the Striker talents video kind of went over, for instance, how much a Coyote is versus a Centurion or a Bloody Knuckles and such. So we can kind of, if you take that as a baseline, you can kind of compare these as well alongside of them. And what we see, especially with the Tinkerer, is, yeah, you can exceed the Coyote's damage. And because of that, it is going to become one of the meta pieces. I would say, though, in coordinated teams or for smart players, it is definitely worth it. If you see that there isn't a Coyote in the team, if everybody's running Tinkerers, for one person to maybe give up their Tinkerer, take a Coyote, give a group-wide buff, and that way it will actually be a better outcome group-wise, even if that player kind of will be a little bit behind. But as we saw as well, it isn't that far behind. Coyote is never like immensely behind. Except, for instance, with Frenzy, we saw that there is a very impactful talent that we can take, especially on LMGs. LMG's downside still will be there, of course, and we could always take Frenzy on Coyote. Nothing is stopping us, but here especially having kind of, hedging our bets, taking Killer, for instance, something we can activate and kind of hold us over until Frenzy comes in, is much more of a thing to do, I feel, than, for instance, just having Coyote and then just waiting for that Frenzy to come in to really push the numbers. Because of that, yeah, I feel especially a Frenzy for LMGs is really impactful. Fast hands as well is, yeah, I used to love running fast hands, was my main talent pick. When Killer and Measured kind of got a little bit bigger, yeah, I kind of leaned way more towards them, and I feel rightfully so. Just when it is that big of a difference, you kind of have to lead with that. But now, if we can have a little bit of a loss and then have fast hands back in there and have Killer alongside of it, for instance, yeah, that is actually, I've been enjoying that a lot. And yeah, just being able to reload so much faster, especially on weapons that reload pretty quick or slowly in the case of, for instance, the FAMAs, or weapons that really need to reload a lot, like the Tac Vector. But yeah, overall, we saw that Tinkerer is definitely a pick, and in a lot of situations, we will stick this in there and make a very good use of it. And I don't think it displaces everything else. In the end, it is actually pretty balanced, and that was also my estimation of it with the PTS, and of course as well with the speculation video that we did. As yeah, some people have been going like, it's humongous, it's too big, it's too OP. We don't see that here on Strikers yet. There are some other places it can be a lot more impactful, as we'll move into, for instance, Ongoing Directive. And yeah, on Ongoing Directive, it actually definitely displaces everything else that we could pick for it. But that's also kind of fine if that build kind of, aligns with that, in the same way that, Eclipses and Vials kind of live together. We'll have Tinkerers and ODs definitely going together. And yeah, we'll go all into those future videos. And also as well, speaking about OD, talking about it, the next build showcase I'll do is actually an OD build showcase. And I'll try to do it actually before the end of this season and get that out. As OD has been impacted by Tinkerer so much that I feel it's time to do a redo and give the new versions a try. And as well, in there, we can kind of take the Tinkerer and run it with the talents like Vindictive and like with... Pressure Point alongside of Sadist and Frenzy even as well. So we have a few choices there, and I want to kind of highlight those in a build showcase. But yeah, those will all come in the future together with the other parts of this Tinkerer video. So yeah, I hope you joined me for those. If you did enjoy this video, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below. It does help out, so I'll do a little bit of shilling here. Hope to catch you all in the future. As always, have a good night.